Ladies and gentlemen, I, Pronago, bring you another episode of Pr0totype, my solo design podcast, and oh boy, do I hope that whoever listens to this accepts my invitation. You are invited, cordially of course, to the first competitive event of the year, the March Invitational A. And I say A because we will have many March Invitationals, and I say many because I think we'll at least have 3, and I'll get into that in a moment, because originally it was only supposed to be 2. So let's talk about what is going to happen in this show. I am going to be previewing the competitive return, the focus of the months of March and April for Cosmonarchy. We will also be talking about the balance overview as things have changed within the project ahead of these events. We'll talk about considerations I have for competitive maps and how our direction for those is evolving as well. And I'll give a little bit of a brief progress update on the Protoss tutorial before getting into donator questions via the Ko-fi website. Yes, you can take a look at the description of this video, hit the link that takes you to our Ko-fi page, send us money, and in exchange, you can ask questions via Discord. So yeah, I recommend being on the Discord server for that. But beyond all of that, it's just good to be involved in this project. And of course, in addition to talking about the forthcoming events, it would really behoove us to get into what the first invitational is actually going to look like. So I will be previewing that event as well. And we do only have a couple of questions here this time around, at least the last time I checked. Sometimes they come in at the last second because I always remind people that I am indeed recording. But nonetheless, we should have some interesting ones for you. As always, the timestamps are available if you want to skip to a specific section. But now, let us begin by talking about March Madness? Yeah, really the biggest thing for me is that Cosmonarchy is going to have a bit more of a competitive focus in the month of March than I thought, and that is because I initially had plans that were going to kind of gobble up the middle of the month for me, so we were only going to be able to run an event on the first week, which is on the 2nd of March, that's this coming Invitational, and the last week, which was, just going to be the second Invitational, kind of run it the same way as the first Invitational, and that way it would basically be like an opportunity for us to first on an invitational A that we're coming up on, what are all the balance changes like? Let's see. And then B, the second one at the end, was supposed to be how have people evolved since then? So that was the plan, and now that my March plans have been shifted to another month, well, that kind of leaves more openings for me to focus on things like competitive maps, obviously the campaign and tutorial related content that I have been working on, and of course the general balance changes that have been going down as I change up some units and shift some concepts around. So there's a lot to cover as far as the balances specifically, like the changes to the meta, if you will, and the actual meaningful changes to the way that the game works. I've talked about refocusing the paradigms of Cosmonarchy, where we do want the scale, we do want the compositional strategies to be more in-depth and provide you with more variety in that respect if you do choose to spend the time. So yeah, let's just cover the fact that we are going to be getting into that. But first, I think it's a high time that I preview March Invitational A. So with the news of forthcoming invitationals still up in the air, we do indeed have this first one, and it's also the first one of its kind that has an individual prize pool. Generally speaking, I think it's a good idea to have events where the prize pools are individualized, but also because they're all crowdfunded, besides, me sending in, I pledged $20 to this one, Lucy pledged 50, Biddy B pledged a couple, like 30 something, I think, after fees, and then Benno sent in 5, Nablime sent in 3, so, there's like a couple of small donators as well that came in, but really, like, heavy hitters were coming in from Biddy B and Lucy, and I appreciate any and all donations to the effect, and the way that it works for those who aren't aware is that it's all going to just the first placers. So it'll be evenly divvied up by, the first placers in that respect. One of the things I was thinking about is maybe we could have some sort of like, I really hesitate to call it a stretch goal because that just reminds me of scam starters, but maybe it could be something like the first $100 is going to be earmarked for first place. And then after that, the next $50 would be earmarked for second places. So basically if we got $150 as a baseline, then the $100 would be split by the first placers, and the $50 would be split by the second placers. And then anything after the 150 would be once again going to the first placers again. So, it could be something like that. I wouldn't necessarily hate that idea. I'm open to other alternative ideas if people have them. Really, I was surprised to see that we would even pass the threshold of $100. I thought I would be the only one maybe who would send in any amount of money. So the fact that we had people pledging immediately was really cool. I hope that they don't blow their loads, so to speak, because obviously we're going to have an individualized prize pool for the big events like Acropolis, but maybe the fact that we'll have run events hitherto, we'll have obviously had more time to build up some hype and get some more people involved. We might be able to secure somebody who would send in the big bucks for that or something like that. I have no real idea what's going to happen there, but it could be pretty big. So let's just enjoy the fact that this time around we do have a prize. Now, the previous invitational that we ran at the end of winter, the Winter Invitational that ran at the 30th of December, that did not have a prize pool, and really the only thing that you got out of winning was bragging rights. So, it was kind of cool, but this one, there's a little bit more stakes involved, right? So that'll be very interesting to see what happens. And for my state, like, again, the prize pool isn't necessarily final. There's still more time for people to send in money if they want to, but even at $108, that's a pretty nice prize pool for, just announcing something and like it immediately getting to that point. And then on top of all of that, something that I didn't really cover yet, but the 12 people that signed up for this event, and then we also have one ringer for Group A, and ideally we can get ringers for B, C, and D, since who knows who's going to actually show up. Last event, by the way, the Winter Invitational, we had 3 out of 4 groups need one person to be replaced. So there is precedent for signing up as a ringer and actually getting to play, because we didn't even have ringers sign up there. I just pinged a bunch of people until we found somebody. Like, My Name Is Lol stood in for Benza, Scholar stood in for Sipiak, and it was... Oh man, I'm trying to remember. Solstice standing in for Keen in Group D of that last event. So there's a lot that went down there that unfortunately, like, we didn't get the original marketed people, like people who were interested in coming in, and for one reason or another, they weren't able to make it. And so that to me is like, oh, well, that's too bad. Obviously one of the things that we would like to do is have the people who originally signed up make it there. But it was cool that we had enough people step in and, be able to and interested in actually doing it. We actually, there was Lundier, Solstice, and Newt all wanted to step in at the same time because we pinged so many people looking for it. Or we just did like the Fraud Monarch ping or whatever. And then Solstice won the number draw. So that was really funny. We went from having, not one too many or one too few people to having two too many people, which is really good because at that point we could have just run a parallel group almost. It's really silly. And I think we added some more interested people who were like kind of on the fence about it. And then they saw that it was filled up and they were like, well, I probably won't get to play, so I won't even sign up. No, there's a good chance you will actually get to play, at least in some of these groups. Scholar is back as Nicholas. He's changed his username as he does often. And Nicholas is someone who has some internet troubles every now and then. So he's like one example of, I was surprised he was able to replace Sipiak. He did have some internet troubles even in his matches, as he often does. So who knows what's actually going to happen once we hit the, this group in the first place. So we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens. But I guess I can go over the debutantes and the people who maybe haven't played that much recently that are coming back. I guess there's really only 2 people that fit that last particular description. But the debutantes start off in Group A. Lundier is finally going to get his competitive debut. Technically, I casted a match between him and the Shambler where they went PvP air-only battles, Stargate first, on Main Street, and it was just like a meme match, but that never made it to the channel. It's unlisted somewhere. Lundier is going to be playing as Protoss in this event, and he is joined by Dead Infested's Terran and Three Crows Protoss. Now, Dead Infested is playing Terran after all the Terran changes. I don't know if he's practiced that much, but, this could be a situation where he could really show how powerful some of the Terran stuff could be, or if he's not really aware of how to play around it, he could get bamboozled and tilted. So I'm not really sure what that's going to look like exactly. But Lundier and Three Crow, I mean, at least the PvP matches are going to be cheesy and silly, because Lundier is very cheesy and silly, and Three Crow is very cheesy and silly. At least that's what I'm assuming is going to happen. So I would prepare Group A. Group A is going to be like, we're not starting off, slowly here. It's going to be a real crazy event, I think. So I'm looking forward to seeing where that goes. On Group B side, Alexander is technically making his tournament debut, but also returning after a long hiatus of not playing. He did play in some castovers, of course. Alexander was on track to participate, I think, in 2 separate events for the Ascension series, but unfortunately wasn't able to make it to either of them because of one reason or another. Like one day, I think he just woke up late and wasn't feeling well, and the other day, I think he had to cancel for some other reason. So maybe I'm mistaken, and he only was ever signed up for one of them. But either way, like he was originally going to, and then there was a missed connection somewhere. So he is on schedule for Group B, and that will be very interesting to see his Zerg in action. Newt is playing Terran in that group as probably the favorite, but also he's playing a race that he's trying to get back into it. He's returning after the last time he played an RTS apparently was in Ascension 7. So he hasn't, it's not even like he's been playing other RTS games. So he's just getting back into the thick of things. On Biddy B's side, Biddy B will be joining that group, and he will also be Protoss, much like 3Crow and Lundier. So already up to 3 Protosses, 2 Terrans, and 1 Zerg so far. In fact, Zerg is, funnily enough, the least represented race within this invitational, which is kind of interesting. I guess Protoss will be the middle ground and Terran being the most. So we'll get to that in just a moment. But I just think it's really interesting that Alexander and Biddy B are going to be in the same group. Biddy B, in some ways, it feels like he almost plays to the level of his opponent. And I guess his like baseline, because he doesn't practice that much and because he doesn't have that much time to play, it does feel like he's very variable in what he can do. I think he might be able to surprise Newt in an early stage match, but if Newt can hold out, he should be the favorite. And if Alexander can drag out a game versus Biddy B, it will at least be silly and ridiculous because they both tire out kind of easily. And so that, I think, could lead to some really silly situations. So I think Group B will be interesting, but I do think Newt should be on track to get some prize winnings under his belt and place first. For Group A, I didn't really predict a winner. I think it's really down to whether or not 3Crow plays to his normal level. He's probably the favorite there as well. So I guess I'll just go back really quickly and predict it'll probably be a 3Crow one. I do give Dead Infested an outside chance to punch above his weight there and take down 3Crow. They have had a bit of a rivalry, as I think 3Crow is the first person to play against Dead Infested, like way back. So, they have a long and storied history. And Lundier, I don't know if he's just happy to be here, but there's also a chance that he just cheeses his way into at least like a puncher's shot, right? We'll see how that one goes. Let's switch over to Group C. This one, the names of the groups, of course. Group A, From Downtown. Group B, Trusty Rusties. But Group C, Terranovirus, maybe. This is obviously the fact that all of the players in this group were signed up as Terran. I say were because our first contestant, Benno, has actually switched his race to Protoss. That means that there are 4 Protosses total in this event. Everybody else seems to want to be Terran with the new changes. We've got the debutant of Green Eggs and Spam. That's going to be his debut in the competitive space. He's never played in a casted match besides that AI match, actually, way back when. And Nicholas is also in this group, so he will be hanging out, hoping that his internet holds as long enough for him to smash his opponents. I do think that I really have no idea where to place Green Eggs in this. I've never seen Benno play Protoss, so I have no idea what to expect out of him either. And he's also making a return similar to Alexander in that respect, where he hasn't played in a very long time. And so that to me feels like, whoa, wait a second here. We've got Green Eggs, who's like a total unknown quantity. Got Nicholas, who, seems to be pretty good on an average day, but struggles in non-mirror matchups. Like if you look back to his performance in the Gauntlet, he absolutely creamed It Depends. He did roll over Luciferius, and those were both TVTs. After that, he went into facing off against Sipiak, seemed to get a good advantage in the early stages of one of the matches, and then got 2-0'd out of it, and that was in the lower bracket because he failed to show up. He was a no-show to the Veek match, and so he didn't have any second chances at that point. And I thought he was favored to take down Sipiak, but I also had underrated Sipiak because I had only seen some casted matches of him, and I didn't know he had been practicing super heavy. So I totally didn't think that he was going to do it, and then Sipiak just repeatedly surprised me as he tore his way through that lower bracket and took Veek to a 5-game series. Anyway, I'm reliving the glory days, but that is a situation where, Scholar did struggle versus Zerg. And I'm not sure, but it feels like he might struggle against Protoss too. And so maybe Benno can use that to his advantage. I'm not sure if Green Eggs can really take him by surprise. I know Green Eggs does a lot of like AI games and theory crafting and practicing in that respect. I don't think he's played against players that much. So that's where it's a total unknown quantity for me. And I don't really know what his baseline level of skill is. But it's cool that he signed up. I'm really looking forward to his games. I guess I have to predict that Nicholas will win this, but I don't know, man. Like, it also depends on whether or not his internet connection holds. So we'll have to wait and see. That one is exciting because Benno, hello, not building Mavericks. That's going to be weird. Green Eggs, I have no idea what to expect out of him because he's an unknown quantity that spends a lot of time thinking about the game. And then Nicholas, well, he's always fun to watch. So we'll just have to see if he can play to his usual self in the mirror matchup, which would give him an edge over Green Eggs, you'd have to think, and survive the non-mirror matchup against Benno. Let's go over to Group D, called No_Chance, which is a reference to Jack Yelansky's Discord username, A_Chance. Jack Yelansky is indeed in this group as Zerg. The Shambler is in this group as Terran, which is one of the things we allowed in this event was an off race, if you like your worst race if you're a class 1. So I guess that would have been like Terran for Hamster, who did sign up as a ringer for Group A. The Shambler, obviously, who is in an interesting position as well, who has been practicing a lot of Terran. So maybe it's still, I don't know if it's actually fair after all, to be honest, but I kind of expected him to not practice. Of course he wants to he wants to win this money. And then Luciferius, of course, as Terran as well. So that's going to be interesting. I am looking forward to seeing who actually really has no chance. I would like to see Lucy come up with some really wacky cheeses. Maybe he can practice against his brother or something. His brother seems to be playing Zerg most of the time, so that could be good practice versus Jack Yelansky. And I don't know what to expect out of him versus Shambler on the Terran side. Shambler, he buys a lot of units. He builds a lot of stuff. He doesn't, at least so far, it doesn't feel like he's understood the theory of what unit to make, even in the mirror matchup. So I do think that as long as you can keep your macro baseline functional, you might not have to worry about too much harassment. You might not have to worry about too many things throwing you off your game. It feels like it's a very one-note direction of attack. But the Shambler listens to these podcasts all the time, so maybe he'll listen to this and think, well, do I agree with that statement? And if so, what can I do to change it? Like his style is never to use drops, right? That's like one thing he said before. And drops are kind of important if Terran wants to do something aggro in the very early stages of the game. So it's interesting to me to imagine what's going to come from that. Lucy obviously is no stranger to drops and using star pads in general. Who knows what we're going to see out of that? I hope that there's going to be some cheese. Also, I've never seen Jack Yelansky play. I know he's got some submissions versus Niblime. He's been practicing against like way back before all of these balance changes hit. He was a kind of a late arrival after Ascension 7 and after the Winter Invitational. So he's like a 2024 Cosmonarch. I'm not sure what to expect out of him, but I've actually heard some pretty good things about him. So he could be a sleeper. Like this guy could actually end up being the guy that takes that group. So, there are potentials here. There are things to think about. And that is the preview of the March Invitational as the players are concerned. But I think we can talk a little bit about the maps. Well, we've done a decent amount of talking about the players of the first Invitational of the year. Let's talk about the maps. We are testing all new maps in the context of March Invitational A. I'm thinking that this is probably going to be a regular thing, that the invitationals that are just for whoever signs up, open to sign up, we'll probably use this as a good opportunity to test maps that we don't normally play. In the Winter Invitational was the first one, so we took a bunch of maps from like the way back, obviously Main Street being one of them, Megalith Empire being another. These maps that are like definitely not fit for current competitive, but they have some interesting aspects to them that should lead to I would say silly, funny matches, but also maybe some serious ones. Like depending, you might get some non-standard stuff out of it. Nonetheless, this time around, we're actually going to be playing with the idea of like, okay, what happens when we put, some of Bitty B's maps and Shambler's maps and Veek's maps and my maps that are all new that people haven't played that much on or at all. And let's see what happens there. So we have Axiom by Bitty B. This is a space platform map. I'll be opening up the maps while I talk about them, so if you hear clicking, that's what's going on. This map is interesting to me because even though it has a lot of negative space in areas that I feel like maybe aren't super elegant, like I would say directly below the P2 main and directly above the P1 main, there's like some weird awkward corners that I feel like are, a lot of ledges that you could just drop on and stuff. So some cleanup is due for that, but there's treasuries in the middle of the map that let you return minerals to them. them if you want to. And that's a very different riff on the whole gas stuff from Derelict. And aside from that, there's, defensible natural into a third that you can pressure from multiple angles, but it's still fairly safe. And then you kind of decide where to go from there. I feel like there could be a lot of interesting games on this map, even if, there's some aspects of it that you might say could be polished up. Like I was talking about those areas where you can drop units in and like awkward locations and stuff. Even if it doesn't really make a significant impact on the gameplay, it might just look a little bit awkward. But beyond that, I feel like the map has some interesting bones to it. And I would love to see whether or not it ends up being successful in serving us pretty good games. Like the whole top left and bottom right areas and left and right areas feels like those could be split into interesting locations. You can definitely vie for control over the middle of the map. I feel like there's a lot of interesting things to look at for this particular map that, now that we have the game be more about, having a more comprehensive composition and maybe having bigger armies and stuff like that, even at an earlier time of the match, scaling up a little bit faster, ever so slightly anyway, still wanting to earn that, of course, and not wanting it to just be given like in other RTS games sometimes you'll see. I feel like at this point, we are ready for maps like this to be both, yes, okay, you can have very bloody matches and stuff, but the defensibility of the first 3 bases in your corner definitely lends towards longer games, I would think. So that's my gut reaction, not having really seen any matches on this yet. Some matches were played way back when it was first made, and now we're going to see if it can be even more action-packed. Stay tuned for that. The second map that I have confirmed for the March Invitational, and by the way, we have 6 out of 8 maps selected. We will be looking for more to round us out for 8 total, so keep that in mind. That's going to be Cocytus. Now, Cocytus is a map by the Shambler. It's an ice platform or ice tile set map. The main thing I look at this map for is that you spawn on the bottom left and the bottom right. At first, people probably will think it's a 4-spawn map, but it is not. You only have 2 spawns, and the whole upper part of the map kind of looks to me inadvertently like a part of what you might be seeing the general direction of maps go, where there's a lot of neutral space to expand into, but it's not a player main. It's not even a potential player main like in a 4-spawn map. It's just, no, you've got the 2 spawns, or even if you have 4 spawns, you still have this territory that's definitely not going to be a player's spawn. And so it's guaranteed neutral territory no matter what the map is, no matter how many players are in it, or what the spawns end up being. And you end up with the opportunity to take a longer game and look towards the top half of the map while you maybe expand up towards there and try to contest your opponent on their side of the map. So I think it's very interesting. I think X mirror and Y mirror maps are probably going to be the future. That's not to say that rotational symmetry and 4-way symmetry and XY symmetry maps can't come back into favor, but I think we'll probably be leaning towards the sort of X or Y symmetry maps, the flipped maps, basically, horizontally or vertically, as opposed to the diagonal stuff. So that's just my gut reaction. I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to that section, but this is a map that's quite like that. It is X mirrored, and so no surprise that it ends up being selected for this. There are some potential concerns about like spacing between the natural and third. Is the third very defensible? But if you secure the third, you can take a quick fourth. So in that way, it's actually not too bad, I think. But we'll see. Build space might be a concern as well, but nonetheless, this is the first time Shambler's map will be played, a map by the Shambler will be played in a competitive event, so he did say that he was happy to see that. He also wants to continue working on other maps such that they can be seen, and so pretty cool to have him join the ranks of the map makers that are on display here that have been featured in one of these categories. So I do think Cocytus can lend towards very brawly early stages since the rush distance isn't too significant, but also I do think that it has a lot of room to potentially explore in a stalemate situation. And we do have a lot of Terrans, as I mentioned, and so stalemates might be a possibility distinctly in the early stages of the game. We will have to wait and see. Moving on to our third confirmed map, it is Fata Morgana. This is an X-mirrored map as well, just like Cocytus. It is a desert map. You have seen it if you've watched some of the castovers leading up to Ascension 7. I was considering whether to pick this map and use it. I decided to go away from that because mostly, honestly, because we had 2 other desert maps that were in the pool at the time, and Nitro Valley being one that was kind of like a mainstay, Derelict being another that was literally the group stage starter. So we decided to not have a third one, but honestly, it seems like a fine map, and I am compelled to include it this time around, just so that we can see if there are any glaring concerns. Because This one is a little bit more compact than Cocytus. It's not as tall as Cocytus is. I think it might be the same width. But the main thing that you would look at for this map is, once again, can you expand into neutral territory after you take your third and maybe even your fourth? To me, I feel like there's probably not as much room for something like that, again, because the map is more compact. But it's just an interesting area to look at, as there's a decent amount of play that you might be able to have in the bottom part of the map. Now, I imagine if this map were like, just a little bit taller, or maybe even a lot a bit taller, and you pushed all of the bases down there towards the bottom even further, like you kept the bottom-most bases on the border and then just expanded the space between them and the ramps into the middle of the map, that would probably be pretty good. And so that's something that I'm keeping sort of like an eye out for. But nonetheless, this map should be pretty exciting for early game stuff, and I do think you can get into some nice mid games, even if maybe it's capped in the late game in terms of base counts and spacing, because again, it's a fairly compact map. But that just means, there's always going to be styles in the map pool. Like, here's a fast-paced map, here's a more medium-paced map, here's a bigger map that has like more rush distance or whatever. There's always going to be a little bit of push and pull there, and I think that's always going to be like what we would want to do. We would have like baseline maps that are always fairly, consistent. They have their own quirks associated with them, but broadly they play the same in terms of their construction and what they allow for. That's probably going to be like, say, half of the maps in the pool are going to be like, yeah, you can take 3 or 4 bases, not necessarily guaranteed, but like on the average. And then there's going to be some maps where you go for longer on average, like Infinite Velocity 2 was in the previous tier 1 map pool, right? And then there would also be a situation where you might have like really fast-paced maps as well that tend to maybe cap out at 2 or 3 bases. And maybe we would just stray away from those more than we would stray away from the big ones. But I do think that the big ones are going to be like maybe 2 maps out of each map pool, and then the rest of it will be made up of some sort of ratio or spectrum of like more normal standard maps where, yeah, you probably can get to 20 minutes reliably if you're even skilled, and then around that point is when it cuts off. So again, we'll have to wait and see on how that's all evolves, because if we do end up getting really long game times, it might necessitate a format change where we do like if we assume that like games are going to trend longer, which I think might happen anyway because of player skill, but remains to be determined. One thought is that maybe we would have to split up the group stage into 2 separate days and run 2 groups on the first day and 2 groups in the second day, and that way we would have plenty of time to handle everything else along the way. So there's more things that we can do and plan for. Definitely something to consider. The 4th map in the pool is Omnivore. This is a map that I made by Bounty from Mystery Meat. It has a lot of options for you to do micro expansions in the corners, the 4 corners. And you do spawn XY. It is top right-ish, like 12 o'clock-ish, and then 6 o'clock-ish for your spawns. I was never really fully satisfied with how I cemented the pathway, the flow to the sort of like distant side of your base, because it feels like you've got a lot of room, but it's maybe a little bit clunky. However, in practice, maybe this isn't so bad. I haven't actually been able to test this just yet. So I know that there was one game played on it between Hamster and Nablime that I have yet to cast, but that's exciting for me to take a look at. Beyond that, we have access to fairly, I would say, like decently safe natural, but not with the cliff. Like there is a cliff that you can stand on, but it's not a guarantee that you're going to be able to attack the incoming units. They can sort of position themselves in such a way that they can avoid some of that threat. And I feel like that is going to allow you to be a little bit more aggro. You can also do some nice drops or ferries over the water. That feels like something that might end up happening depending on the matchup. And there's a lot of neutral mineral fields. Well, they're all neutral, but there's a lot of basically almost depleted mineral fields that when you do end up depleting become walkable, right? And so you can mine them out relatively easily. This is one of the things that Mystery Meat was asking me for when he bountied for this map. So that is what this map is all about. I don't really think it'll be that spectacular of a map overall, but maybe we'll get some surprisingly good games on it, and maybe I'll have some ideas for tweaks that I can make that are kind of low level that would then allow me to potentially include it for like the Acropolis map pool. At the very least, I hope that I can take some ideas from it and apply it to future maps, but that is the first map by me in the pool. Actually, I don't have another map in the pool just yet, but I am working on a couple, so we'll see if that ends up adding to it. Our 5th map that is confirmed so far is Pantheon, another compact-ish map by Veek7. This one unfortunately had the issue with the minimap scaling, which is one of the main reasons why I decided to not include it in the Ascension 7 map pool, because it was made around that time. Minimap scaling is on the list of things to work on so that we can afford to use like map sizes like the 160 map size without it looking really small. The main thing about this map, though, is that I think it's a fairly open map. Like it's a map where there's a lot of map control you can take just by taking over the middle of the map that in practice I think Veek didn't necessarily want to be the case. Nonetheless, there's a lot of flanking you can do around the sides, and I do think that it can lend towards some pretty exciting matches in the early stages of the game. This is actually a map that was used for, I think, the second mission of Trenches, if I'm not mistaken. The one that I actually struggled quite a bit with versus Nightman. So you can watch my playthrough for that if you want to get a look at what the layout actually looks like. But it's well doodadded, it's well decored. For me, one of the concerns is build space, but you can take over the ruins in outside of your natural, so that's not the end of the world. And another concern would be like, I guess maybe the overdetermined nature of certain aspects of the map for map control. I have talked with Veek about it, and I do think that this is another case where if the map was like spaced out bigger, he even said it himself, if everything was spaced out like 15% more, it would probably be a banger. And I kind of agree. I think like if the pathways were just a little bit more, you'd probably want to keep the distance in terms of rush distance relatively similar. So I'm not really sure how you would achieve that with the mains and the naturals, but I think everything else could definitely provide or benefit from having a little bit more space between it, because then it lets you jockey for position in stages instead of kind of just being like, oh, I was able to take over the ramp that is closest to you that leads to middle. Well, I guess I'm just going to have full dominion over the map. So that is something to consider, but another map that I think it's going to be cool because it's a well-crafted baseline map. Like it's certainly acceptable. Once you get past the mini-map scaling issue, it's certainly acceptable to play on. And it's a map that people haven't seen that much. So that's another reason why people might be showing up for this. And our final map that I have confirmed so far is yet another Shambler map. It's Titan Forge. Now, Titan Forge has been updated since I actually authorized it for this tournament because it was shuffled after some playtesting between the Shambler and Newt. But beyond the updates, the minor updates to the layout, like it's fairly stock standard. One of the things that you will notice about this map is that it is a Y-mirrored map. So going back to what I said earlier about how, like, yeah, a lot of these maps are probably going to be X-mirrored or Y-mirrored instead of the XY or the four-way. I think that's pretty cool that we're seeing more maps like this. Y-mirror is what Megalith Empire and Otherworld were, if you know those maps. And X-mirror is like Fata Morgana and indeed Cocytus. So as of right now, I believe that puts us at 3 out of the 6 maps that I have confirmed are actually basically Y or X mirrored, with Axiom, Omnivore, and Pantheon being XY. So if you're not a mapper, you might not know what this means, but basically it's just like, what degree is the symmetry exactly? Like how did we get to the symmetry? What is actually symmetrical about it? I'm looking forward to seeing what, I guess I did cast a TVT on this map, and it was interesting. There's a lot of map control that you can do. There's a lot of cliffs all over the place. I think that maybe in non-mirror matchups, it might be a bit more interesting to take a look at. But I'm definitely looking forward to seeing what the evolution of the matchups are on a map like this, because you can take a lot of quick bases, but it is a little bit hard to do so safely. Like the natural is okay, fairly easy to defend actually. Thanks to some high ground on both sides. But the third has some easy high ground for your opponent to just put a unit there and deny. And so if you're Terran, you can kind of build off location and then just land there, and that's whatever. But if you're Zerg or Protoss, you might get shellacked by like Vultures or Goliaths or something from that ramp. I think you could probably even hit it with like a Maverick. I haven't tested that. But it's designed to be very easily harassable. And then there's a bunch of other high ground areas that kind of promote you sort of ferrying units above the ground to get a cliff advantage. Newt was actually doing that against the Shambler with like Trojans loading up phalanxes and shuffling them up there. That's definitely something that you can do. And I think beyond that, this is just an interesting map to see, like, how exactly does it scale up? I do wonder if ground armies aren't like too disproportionately disfavored on this map due to the pathways, but that is something that I think testing will show. And I figured it's a cool looking map, and I won't lie, aesthetics do play a part in what I select for the maps. One of the reasons why Xcedu got, I think, as many chances as it did was partially because Beaver was very receptive to making changes to it and updating it and tweaking it and retooling it and stuff. But also partially because it was a very novel looking map that had a lot of changes to it compared to, custom tiles compared to some of the other offerings, right? And so Titan Forge is a fully custom tile map. It's an installation type map. So technically, I think the tile set is Badlands, right? But it's actually installation in practice. And that to me is, it's hats off to Shambler for placing all of the tiles in a manual, sort of manual effort. There are some custom ones that are broken that I'll have to remind him of to fix, or maybe I'll just fix them myself and let him know that I fixed it. But either way, it's a compelling map to look at, I think, in terms of it being novel. It's definitely a novel experience, and so I'm eager to see what ends up happening. So that leaves us with 2 more map slots left. I am working on another desert map to go along with Fata Morgana in that respect. I'm not sure if that map will end up being selected, of course. So yeah, overall our tile sets are space platform, ice, desert, twilight, jungle, and installation, which leaves us with 2 slots left. Maybe we can do something like, I guess, regular Badlands or urban. That would probably end up being, something like Main Street or whatever. And then, I guess I'm trying to think if there's any other tile set that we didn't use. Because obviously installation isn't technically a tile set, right? Badlands is the tile set. And I guess Ashworld is the other one. So maybe we can get like a Badlands map and an Ashworld map, and that would really help wrangle everything. But we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens. We'll see which maps end up being selected for this. And that is the end of the map preview. So let's go on to the other topics. It only makes sense to talk a little bit about the competitive map considerations in more detail now that I have concluded the overview and preview of which maps have already made the cut. Again, we're looking to capitalize on some of what the paradigm refocusing actually was with the balance update that happened. We want maps that have more room for bigger armies, bigger bases, without sacrificing the generally acceptable rush distance between player mains. And the reason we don't want to sacrifice that is because we still want to leave the door open for early finishes if somebody makes a cascading series of failures and somebody else capitalizes upon that. And so I think even our early finishers are probably going to look like between 6 and 10 minutes, which honestly, like, that doesn't sound like a lot of time, but a lot of other RTS games can be over in like 3-4 minutes, right? You can lose a Brood War match or a StarCraft 2 match in about that time, sometimes faster. Now, maybe those are outliers, and that's probably fair to say, but definitely something that I think is worth doing is trying to stabilize the game such that you don't completely remove the opportunity. You don't close the door on early advantages snowballing into a victory, but you definitely still provide tools for the game to go bigger. And to my, I guess like the way that I would try to break this down is the average map size so far has been 128 by 128. And my thinking is, it might even be good to start on a map with that size, make a layout that is acceptable for, what you're doing, and then expand it to be bigger in one dimension or both dimensions. And that would allow you to add more neutral terrain around the 128 by 128 mains or standard core of the map. And I think that's pretty neat. Now, I don't think that that's like super... It's not something that's enabled to you very well through the current pipeline because resizing breaks a lot of the isometry and you have to like remake it. So it can be frustrating, but maybe it's worth it just to block that out. And otherwise it might be good to just eyeball what an actual 128 by 128 size looks like and see what you can do from there. The main thing that I would say about that is I think it's good to preserve the ability to have early action mean something instead of just being like the first in many steps of, snowballing an advantage. You could actually capitalize upon it and then go from there into closing the game relatively soon. That's the vision that I want to preserve. I want you to be able to do stuff like that. But there is an open question as to whether or not that will be possible in a world where we allow you to, have a lot more room sort of behind your base or in neutral space. My thinking is, it's probably a good practice to have to travel a little bit far in order to actually make it to another base that is like behind your main or something. That way you're not necessarily encouraged to take that base. Actually, a bit of a pull for you guys, but the first mission of Trenches is built off of Sunstarved. 3Crow actually made some edits to that layout. It's a map that I made way back. And Sunstarved has this funny thing where it doesn't really have a natural, and your actual natural is like across a ravine and like really far away. If that was the kind of distance that you had to a base, I think you could actually do some pretty interesting stuff with something like that, where, yeah, you can choose to expand really far back, then you're isolated, but maybe you're safer just based on distance. Like it is a potential thing. I feel like that could be an option that is some sort of underscoring of what I'm talking about here. Again, I don't think it would be ideal ever for players to actually take a base in that sort of area, but that's just because I feel like it's really, really vulnerable. Instead, we should still keep the core construction of like main to natural spacing that we already have in maps like Derelict and similar, but we should do so with the understanding that we're also going to add room for, say, 3, 4, 5 expos in neutral territory, preferably like 2 to 3 per player or something like that. So a total of like 4 to 6, and I feel like that's probably a pretty good benchmark for that sort of thing. And again, this will be made easier by doing X mirror or Y mirror maps instead of XY. I guess you could probably still do this with like 4-way symmetry, but I mean, if you're doing it as 4-way symmetry, there's going to be a point where if your map dimensions aren't square, your 4-way symmetry isn't actually going to be caught properly, right? And so you're actually going to be missing certain details there on like one side of the map or whatever. But that's fine. Like actually, SCM Draft works pretty well with that, so that's not a concern for our map editor stuff. And honestly, with this in mind, I think as we get closer and closer to understanding like good baseline conventions and agreeing on what makes good competitive maps for Cosmonarchy, that would be a good opportunity then to say, maybe make inroads and reach out to the map makers of maps that are actually played by Brood War pros and say, hey, this is what we've developed so far based on our very different game than Brood War. Would you guys like to try making maps with this in mind and maybe see like if they end up playing well or whatever? And that would be an interesting option there. Maybe we could have like a melee map contest or whatever. Certainly, it wouldn't be a bad shout, I think. So there you have it, some considerations and thoughts about competitive maps. But we all know what the next topic is. It's the balance overview. So as you may have noticed, if you were paying attention to the castovers that have been published to this channel, we do have some balance tweaks and changes. A lot of meaningful things have been different about the tech trees for Terran and a little bit for Zerg. I'll talk about the Zerg a little bit last, I guess. We'll go Terran, Protoss, then Zerg as far as the overview. But the broad sort of like surface level, like low resolution view where you're just sort of zoomed out and you're thinking, give it to me like real quick. What exactly has changed about Cosmonarchy, Pr0totype? Well, I'll tell you, it's this. Cosmonarchy now has a little bit faster training time on fodder units, right? The rank and file, like Mavericks and Legionnaires and stuff like that. You'll have a little bit of reduced mineral costs for powerhouse units like the Goliath and the Dracodon. Generally speaking, there will be time reduction costs for a couple of other odds and ends units. Air is by and large a little bit harder to access. The star pad costs more minerals. The star port costs a lot more Vespene now. Like the costs have actually changed a bit, where previously it was 200 minerals, 150 gas. Now it's 150 minerals, 225 gas. So it's a net nerf in terms of resource cost overall, but it's also biasing it towards gas, which is going to delay your tech. And that's also going to help encourage capping, right, with like the reservoir and similar things. Now, the other stuff to keep in mind is that, broadly speaking, air is actually getting a little bit worse. Like, the air units themselves are going to be more expensive, except for the Valkyrie, the Lanafect, the Vithrilisk. Those units got buffs in some way, shape, or form because they are disproportionately more powerful versus air, right? They're air superiority air units, so anti-air air units. And those got some buffs. We also saw some adjustments, or will see some adjustments, that make things specifically better versus anti-air in some ways. Some slight nerfs, the Speartith Cesiant. I know I said I'd talk about Zerg last, but bears mentioning that the Speartith Cesiant now costs gas, so it's a little bit of a nerf there because previously it was mineral only. But that's another point to make, is that defenses actually now cost Vespene. So Sentinels will cost you 200 minerals instead of 250, but 50 gas. So again, building a lot of Sentinels is going to meaningfully impact your gas count. That means that you are going to have less money to spend on things like tech. Now, with all of this said, as well as, of course, things like the order timer being removed such that you have no delay on queued orders, and that means that things like mining are a little bit more efficient. Now it's a lot snappier when you tell a worker to turn into a structure for Zerg, for example, like the Droloths actually just mutate almost instantaneously. It looks a little unnatural and unsettling, actually. Might be something that maybe we should just, for flavor, add a little bit of a delay, but nonetheless, it's definitely better than what it was, and that to me is it's compelling to make things a little bit snappier, right? Your unit control can be a little bit more precise. You're still going to have silly pathing stuff, but actually, Vik even suggested that maybe the order queued timer going away might mean that the units will repath a little bit more frequently and thus be better at navigating stuff like that when they get into traffic jams. I haven't personally confirmed that yet, but it could be interesting. It could be a thing. And the big thing for Terrans, all of the add-ons used to have mixed requirements. Some would not require anything like the Commandment and the Rotary for the Starport, and others like the Covenant for the Stockade or the Palladium for the Fulcrum famously required the Atlas. Well, that's no longer the case. Instead, the Covenant and the Palladium are more expensive. The Guild Hall also more expensive, but all of them enabled by default. You no longer need to tech up in order to use add-ons of structures that you already unlocked, be they the Stockade, the Fulcrum, or the Captaincy. Those are the three source factories that were, these production structures were affected by this change. It's also worth noting that that means that the Quarry and the Anvil are now available from the word go. Now, personally, I still think that the Anvil and similar stuff is like a tier 2 in terms of cost, and so I actually have not moved them from the tech map from tier 2 to tier 1. But the Quarry has been moved down just because it is pretty obviously something that you would make alongside the Treasury. The Quarry requires 125 minerals and 100 Vespine. Coincidentally, that's the same resource cost as the Starpad. I haven't compared their time costs, but the Quarry does take a little bit of time. And I think that's interesting because so there's an interesting dynamic that happens when you add comsats in stock StarCraft, that you're giving up 2 rounds of workers during the construction phase of that comsat. So usually they just end up becoming behind by 4 workers based on whatever they were, because they add the comsats at the same time as their main and natural at the same time, right? And so that's interesting to me. And I felt like the Quarry is kind of like the same thing now, except it's also an expenditure for resources, and it is going to put you back economically quite a bit. Now, if your opponent, say in a mirror matchup, goes for a Fulcrum and then goes into, Goliaths or something kind of heavy hitter, and then you go into Stockade, into Quarry, and save your gas, you might be at an army deficit because you've gone for this economic thing. And also, you're building a Quarry when you could be building workers out of the Ministry. And so eventually you can catch up. So it's an interesting dynamic. But there is an opportunity for your opponent to scout that and then punish you. And I feel like that's another common thread here, is that scouting is going to be more, not just important, but also rewarded. In the past, it would be really cryptic sometimes what your opponent was actually doing. When we made the changes post Ascension 7 and made it so that Zerg had to specialize their tech structures in order to get access to things like Nathricors, Vorvricors, Skithricors, and Bactylisks at tier 1, that was something that we made as a deliberate decision for the purposes of providing Zerg with more tells so that their opponents actually had ways to intuit what they were actually going to do. Like if they've gone for a Vornath Pond, the evolution to the pool, and they're not harvesting gas, well, they're probably not getting Nathricors. So you can scout the Vornath mutation, but if you don't scout whether they're harvesting gas, you're still kind of in the dark about which specific thing that they're making. At the same time, that's a lot better than seeing the pool and not knowing if they're making an air unit or 2 ground units. So that's just one of the options, one of the examples. Now with the Terrans, you can go see a Fulcrum First opener, which has become a lot more popular, but if you don't scout the add-on, then you might not really know what's going on. If you see the Fulcrum First and they're not harvesting Vespine anymore, it might be a fast scrapyard. It might just be that they're not interested in going Palladium and they're just going to go like basic Fulcrum units while they maybe go for an expansion or something. There's many different things that it could be. And I think that that's much more interesting in general. But also, again, it's not just that scouting now is more important. It's also that you will be more rewarded because you have more explicit information about what your opponent is doing when you piece together different elements of the puzzle. And I think that's a really big deal too. So with the add-ons changed, that does mean that you'll see like phalanx pushes and stuff essentially in the very early stages of the game. I do think that they scale pretty well as like a proper unit, and you can benefit from them in tank mode a lot more than maybe some people think if they have Brood Waritis and they just think of them as Brood War units. The tank mode is not as beneficial in StarCraft, but in Cosmonarchy it's a very, very good option, especially that it let's just say it has a lot of armor. It packs a punch in terms of a tank. Literally a tank, right? Like a tank roll. And so that's something that you can absolutely use. It might even be too powerful in tank mode, in all honesty. That's something that I am open to as a potential, because it deals like 25 damage a pop. So maybe it needs like a higher cooldown on that or something. But, there's details. Those are details we can figure out. Stim pack has also been revised, so there's a delay between the damage that you take on the stim and the injection itself. The main thing that I would say about that is stim pack might end up being more impactful as a result of this change, because it does nerf the unit, but it does so in a way that I think makes the behavior of the unit more interesting, because now you can try to catch the units and then they've just dealt damage to themselves, and if you can kill them before the buff kicks in or meaningfully wound them such that they don't stay alive for very long after the buff kicks in, then you reduce the impact of the ability, and it's more about planning. But at the same time, even though this is a nerf to the unit and to the ability, the fact that the stim is like it is will mean that you as the Terran player can choose your actions and plan around it, and I feel like that's a better and more interesting expression of skill than simply pushing the button and getting the buff immediately. So stim pack was never that interesting to me. It feels a little bit more interesting now. We're going to see how that one works out. The alternative that was discussed was basically figuring out some way to make it a passive thing instead of something that is an active. But it's hard to do that when you're incurring a penalty. You want to do that as a choice. So if you're going to be taking damage, it shouldn't be something you do passively, in my opinion, especially not on such a core unit. You want to have more precise control over taking taking damage or whatever. So there you go. Some more thoughts on that. I haven't actually gone through and adjusted a bunch of tier 3 stuff just yet. Things like the Aeon, maybe the Autocrat, these are on my list of things to look at. However, I think that overall things are probably okay. I am a little bit concerned about the Reclamation. I feel like Reclamation, as a general rule, might end up not being able to preserve hostile reanimated units. So the hostile corpses that are reanimated might end up decaying no matter what, while the allied ones might be buffed in such a way that you actually just get them back and they don't decay, even with no reclaimer nearby. I haven't decided on that yet, but that might be like the push and pull that I do to make it more about a defensive option. I've talked about this in probably the last podcast, but also in other general content, like talking about my potential revision of that in like castovers and stuff. The Madrigal revision, I think I will be going forward and pressing forward with the anti-air revision, which basically means that when it's in its mobile mode, it's Imperioso mode. That is the mode that allows it to shoot air units only, whereas deploying it into Furia mode will let it shoot both of them and work like it currently does. And I feel like this change would allow me to bias its costs a little bit more, but also it would reduce overlap where you can make your first unit a Madrigal, and you might not have great siege power, but you will have more flexibility compared to the Phalanx. And I feel like the Madrigal currently, when it's fighting ground units, is maybe about as good as a Phalanx in tank mode, obviously not as good in siege mode. But it feels like there shouldn't be that role overlap, and so I am considering it mostly for those reasons. There's another revision that is on the books that I want to make, which is the Barghest, and that is over in the Protoss side. So we might as well talk a little bit about Protoss. I don't have as much to say about them, like the Zealot got tweaked a little bit. The Legionnaire now makes faster. Zealot also, I think, makes a bit faster. Amaranth makes a lot faster. So, we dropped the Ecclesia's cost to be 50 minerals, 50 gas, I think, or maybe it was 50-75. No, it's 50-50. So we'll see how that one works. I might make it 50 minerals, 75 gas, and then increase its power so that it still has that idea of like Protoss units are more powerful than the other units, because 75 gas is like something you might pay for like a tier 2 Zerg unit or a tier 1.5 Terran unit or something, depending on what it is. And so there is that. Units out of the lattice got adjusted to be generally cheaper in some way, shape, or fashion, and also a little bit maybe less good in terms of like durability or whatever. The idol, for example, was adjusted in such a way. And then moving ahead, I have not made significant changes to the robotics branch of tier 2. I have adjusted, of course, the Stargate units a little bit. Again, the land effect is a little bit more lethal, has one extra armor pen, so it'll scale a bit better as a anti-air superiority unit. I haven't adjusted anything in tier 3 or 4 yet for Protoss, I do not believe. Maybe I've made some small adjustments to things like the Uptecton or whatever, but nothing significant just yet. I did fix a bug with the Steward strafing, so it'll be a little bit more consistent. But beyond that, it's there was no like deliberate balance changes that were made for that. And that's why one of the reasons why I don't really have much to say about these guys. The Crucible was adjusted to be 25% increase, 50% increase instead of 100%. So it doesn't double it. It 0.5x's it, if you will. Or I guess it's like, it's 1.5x, because if it was 0.5x, it would actually be having it. Whatever, math. The Crucible is now something that steroids buildings a little bit less, and it's also cheaper. So the idea behind it is that previously it was just making static defense insanely ridiculously powerful, and on top of that, cutting the production time of units in half has a pretty significant effect. I still think the current one will be really strong. We'll just have to see if it's too strong or whatever. And the Barghest revision that I do want to do involves basically activating when it attacks a buff that increases the armor penetration of nearby allies. And that will be something that I think Protoss might sorely require. I mean, generally they hit harder, so armor doesn't necessarily affect them too negatively, but I feel like the Barghest will be pretty nice in that respect. For stacking on top of your ground units and trying to enchant them whenever it attacks. So that will also coincide with the removal of its multi-target, because multi-target is a Terran only thing now conceptually, and so that will at some point happen. It might not happen before the tournament. The Madrigal one I'm going to be focused a bit more on, and it's a little bit more involved because I need like different reads and stuff, probably a different missile, maybe not, maybe we'll see. But either way, there will be some changes for those two units in particular. And that brings us to Zerg. So in addition to some tier 1 units for Zerg becoming a little bit more fodder-y, like a little bit less expensive and a little bit less durable, the Zoroastrolith and the Izira core being among them, I think one of the biggest changes for Zerg overall was the Vilgora core. Now when you attack it, after a 2-second delay, it releases Carapace Swarm, but in a smaller area, and only shielding for 100 damage. But this behavior doesn't have an internal cooldown per se. You just have to not be within a Carapace Swarm when you take damage in order to start proccing it. And so the idea is that it can just sort of like move forward, and if you movement speed enchant it with the Cascathalor or the Zoroastrolith, then it'll move forward pretty quick, and you'll leave behind a sort of like trail of these Carapace Swarms. Now, they only stay alive for 5 seconds, and 100 damage is not that much to absorb, but I feel like this will encourage their use. And the other thing that this will encourage, or that will encourage their use, is the fact that now the Vilgora core mutates into the Estratholeth. So that is very different than what we had previously, where the Estratholeth required a different structure entirely. So now when you upgrade your Betrayal Nest into a Almacus Anter, you will get access to the Estratholeth from the Vilgora core, which previously did not have a morph. There was a planned one, but that's that. So that is a pretty big damn deal. Everything else has already been adjusted. Again, I broadly speaking tried to bias mineral and gas costs a little bit differently, bumping up gas costs on powerful units that were tech units that were more specialized. And another big deal is that the Matroleth now has Blissful Embrace, just like the Akistra core, except the Matroleth obviously can't attack, unlike the Akistra core, so it can't do it self-sufficiently. And the ability is now something that takes 3 seconds in order to do. And so the Matroleth being slower than the Akistra core by a considerable margin now that I've nerfed it, and being a bit more expensive than it used to be, should still be a nice sitting duck, a juicy target if you can get it off of your back. But that does mean that Infestation will be more front and center for Zerg players if they care to do it, and we might see some of that. Obviously, we don't have that many Zergs in the Invitational, so we might not see some of that. But I am looking forward to seeing the unit in action, and we'll see if we need to make any adjustments. Gas costs were added to the tier 2 defenses for Zerg, and the Larvosk Cesiant was moved as a gas-intensive option in tier 1. So it's 125 gas, which is a pretty steep cost for a tier 1 Hatcherosk. But when you factor in the Droleth, Kagrant, and Larvosk Cesiant costs for minerals, you're talking about 125 minerals in totality, plus the opportunity cost of a worker. That might not be enough, considering it's 300 minerals for a Hatcherosk plus 50 for the worker. And so you're talking about less than half of the mineral cost. And so that might require me to nerf the structure, but we will see what things happen. Maybe it'll even be adjusted before the tournament actually goes live. But that's something to share your thoughts on. And I guess that's pretty much it, man. We've kind of covered all of the things that I wanted to cover. We do need to talk a little bit about the tutorial, so I guess I can do that now. For me, the Protoss tutorial is just a very quick progress update here before the questions. I have completed a skeleton of the script where I know the kinds of events that I want to hearken on and really draw the player's attention to. And this includes details about the cornerstones, and I'm trying to make sure to keep them in universe and sensible so that the dialogue doesn't feel really awkward. But for me, I am also concerned about like making sure that the player actually understands it. However, I do think I've learned some really nice lessons from releasing the Terran tutorial, and at some point I will be going back to revisit that and update that and redo the script for that and then get the voice acting redone for it. But as it currently stands, I think the Protoss tutorial will be pretty strong. The skeleton of the script is done. I need to fill in some more dialogue, then voice act that dialogue, and then put the triggers in the actual map. So I guess maybe in the week following the Invitational, we should actually see that tutorial finished. I thought I would have a little bit more time to work on it, but I ended up doing a lot more involved balancing stuff, and then now I'm working on melee maps as well, so my time is a little bit spent in that respect. But nonetheless, we've got plenty of time to do this sort of thing, so you can absolutely expect the Protoss tutorial to be finished probably before the first 7 days of March, if I had to suspect, but we'll see how the Invitational itself goes and what the fallout is from that. And that is that. Well, boys, I hope you got time for me to answer some questions, because it's time for me to answer some questions. Again, if you want to support Cosmonarchy, you like the sound of this, you like the cut of our jib around here at the No Frauds Club, head on over to the coffee link in the description, send us some cash, tell us what you like about the project, and maybe hop into our Discord and ask us some questions during these podcast recording sessions. All right, without further ado, we've got 3 questions for you guys here today. It's going to start off with Myrian. Myrian asks, how much thought is given towards ideology or religion as motivation for regencies, nations, and powers in your works? Or do you generally prefer more material reasons for conflict? Sir, I definitely think that ideology and religion, perhaps you could call it that, is I would say a significant driver of a lot of things. Now, ideology is a little bit vague because it might be something that you can just define as like completely a-religious, completely like secular, I guess. I'm not 100% sure if you actually can, because I feel like, at least for humans, there's like a religious instinct or impulse, and we often fill it with stuff. So who the hell knows whether or not that's something you can actually have as like secular ideology. Almost seems like maybe it's like what Gandhi said about Western civilization. It's a good idea. I'm not even sure if it is a good idea, by the way, but that's the kind of glibness that I would take that with. But beyond that, I would say in the context of the settings, there are definitely some characters and some regency, some powers. Like if you look at Zabalba, my sci-fi setting, that is totally OC, Donut Steel. The main thing that about things like the Githrovan and even the Keltar is, I don't know if you could call it religious. I definitely think there's a lot about the Githrovan that feels religious in nature, because there's like this divine calling that they feel sworn to, and that they indeed swear themselves to. And then there's even like, punishment if they are, if they fall short of the ideals and the goals. And they definitely have this feeling of like holier than thou because they are after this divine goal and stuff like that. So there is absolutely an element of that where, they want to be the universe's caretakers. You can say it's a nice idea, but they are, the odds are stacked against them in that front, yet they still persevere. And so that definitely feels like something where you wouldn't take that if you didn't have an ideology, like an ideological convincing, right? And maybe it could be argued that like you might have people doing that because they believe that, but like in actuality, the puppet masters don't believe that, and they're doing it cynically for like resources and other gains. That's not what's happening with the Githrovans exactly, but you could make an argument that something like that could be happening for somebody, for example, like maybe in Dune, right? Like stuff like that would happen where there's cynical people at the helm, but, manipulate. And that's a lot of what the Bene Gesserit are all about. And so that's fine as like an idea, but I still think that religion and ideology plays a core part of that, because without the religious and ideological aspects of whatever the people believe, you still wouldn't have the outcome, right? And so you can still, even if the leaders and owners are cynical, they still are using those elements in order to push their agenda. So you still have to say that there's a component paid to it. So I do think about that, whether it's, cynical or earnest. I do think about like how that ideology and how the, the secular or non-secular elements of a particular, like society at large play into things. So I do think about it. There are a lot of material reasons, but oftentimes I feel like those material reasons can feel elevated or more interesting if there's an ideological bent to why you went about doing the thing that makes you need the resources to begin with. And I guess if that makes any sense, then you might be on the track of where I'm thinking about, how I'm coming to the conclusions that I'm coming to, and why I'm playing with the ideas that I play with. Is okay, you might need to, take out this planet or defeat this enemy or assemble this army or acquire these resources. But the reason for you doing that is something. And, in Day of Blood for the Terran campaign for Cosmonarchy, it's, you're trying to overthrow this government and you're also trying to survive against the Zerg. So, there's a lot of material reasons there. But hopefully there's like room for me to explore the ideological underpinnings of why people do that, and maybe even the religious underpinnings of why they do that too, depending on the circumstance. I will say it's not something that is super front and center in a lot of my work, but I think it's probably impossible to not have it lurk at the very least beneath the surface, even if you don't do so deliberately as the writer, just because like Western civilization is kind of undergirded by that anyway. So thanks for your question, and let's move on. The Shambler asks, you have to make a sci-fi setting where all machine intelligences are in the Iron Age or lower for one reason or another. How do you go about making a compelling setting based off of this premise? You may include aliens or humans at similar but not greater tech levels if you so desire. So machine intelligences in the Iron Age. Shambler's been thinking about different things. He previously had posed a question about... I don't think it was the previous episode, but it was an episode before that where he talked about like, gunpowder age stuff and sci-fi and aliens and whatnot. So I would say, interestingly enough, I mean, one of the main things is I have to think about like, what do I actually know about the Iron Age off the top of my head as far as like the technological level of stuff. Stone Age and Iron Age and stuff are very different in terms of what they had, but also nothing was really that different. Compared to like sci-fi stuff. So, maybe it's all kind of similar. It's just like the materials that were used, and certain war strategies only became powerful enough or possible enough based on the equipment. So I have to assume you'll have things like crossbows, trebuchets, catapults, weapons of war, siege weapons, barricades, certain battlements, obviously things like ballista, and also things like battering rams, obviously, and stuff like that, right? So I'm assuming you have all that stuff in addition to, your average sort of medieval equipment. And I guess I might be able to work in like magic or whatever too if I want to. But he said sci-fi setting, and there are machine intelligences, and for some reason they are in the Iron Age. I mean, it's a premise that is definitely novel. That's something you can say about it, right? Because it's like something is allowing the machine intelligences to be powered and to still operate, but the tools that they have access to are so out of touch with their reality wherever they came from that they can no longer apply whatever they were learned in terms of the doctrine, right? And so that's interesting. It's I guess I don't know how you couldn't necessarily. I don't think it could be, I guess it would depend on what kind of machine intelligences you have. If you have AI constructs that are kind of intended to be humanesque in the context of things like Halo with their, like Cortana and similar AIs, then you might be able to have like a fish out of water scenario where they try to figure out what exactly is wrong and what is different and what tools they can use. Otherwise, like the fish out of water would just have to be very matter of fact, and I'm not really sure how you would deploy that. So, machine intelligences are in the Iron Age or lower. I guess the first thing is you would have to find a way to present the people, humans or aliens or whatever, the organisms, the organic life, whatever is going on there. They would have to probably have bought into the idea that whatever their machine intelligences are, they are gods or they are like greater voices of wisdom and stuff. I don't know if the machine intelligences would be able to pose as organic members of the species. Maybe that could be like one or two could do that for whatever reason, because maybe those machine intelligences come from a different civilization that were awakened up in a different way or something like that. Because like that's the first thing I can think of is like way in the distance after post-apocalypse, but the machine intelligences survived and were recovered and somehow reactivated and still have like enough fuel or whatever to be autonomous for a time. I guess the machine intelligences would have a quest to produce the required equipment and materials in order to, I I guess like I don't know. I guess they would want to try to extend their lifespan, obviously, and their operational capacity. So that would be one thing. The one of the concerns is like, wouldn't the machine intelligence just immediately industrialize them and share with them all of the requirements for industrialization? If not, at the very least, they would have very advanced for the time weapon designs based on what materials they do have access to. So there'd probably be like mass-produced equipment and stuff, as mass-produced as you can get at that age. Yeah, I don't know. It's hard for me to think about like how you would turn this into something that is. It almost feels like this instead of. I'm going to cheat a little bit on this. I think you could probably make a compelling premise for something like Age of Empires, where you age up through civilizations and like different ages. I guess civilization would be another example of this. And so it's like the obsidian from Onatar that not only controls the weather and like the general complexion of the planet, but also like provides plans and information and stuff. And it simply requires resources. And so you harvest for that and you war over the resources. And maybe like the different kinds of machine intelligences would be the sources of the power or the ways in which you could ascend up the tech tree. And so, you know how in Age of Empires you have different ages for like Iron Age, and then you move up to eventually, I don't know if you get to Space Age, but you get to Information Age, I believe, and stuff like that. And so, to me, I look at that and I think, okay, here we are, ascending up the ages, but what if those ages were actually like different depending on which machine intelligence you had, and basically that would be your race. And so that could be kind of interesting, right? Is you start off in like the Stone Age and you get to the Iron Age and stuff, but that would be like maybe the human followers or like the followers of like one particular machine intelligence that's from humanity. And then there might be an alien machine intelligence from something, and a different alien, like a series of alien machine intelligences that all have their own distinct ages. And so those would be ones that are like, maybe like there could be, you could imagine this could be Onatar, honestly. You could set this in the world of Onatar where you have like blood summon and whatever else. So it's kind of interesting, right? It's kind of neat. Yeah, okay. I guess that's probably how I would do it, thinking about it. Took me a while to get there, but there we got anyway. So there you have it, Shambler. My rambling answer to your question that is, I think, quite difficult off the top of my head. Now, we do have one last question. Pr0totype asks, how will the Askosi aircraft differ from the existing races? Will they have any capital ships as fearsome as the Phobos, Star Sovereign, or Alcagilisk? I haven't really decided, Pr0totype. I guess it's probable that they'll have at least one capital craft type unit. I mean, you look at the Zerg and they really only have the one capital craft type unit with the Alcagilisk. Everything else is kind of like, swarms of, fighters and stuff like that. And that's pretty thematic. Maybe they would get like one more or something at some point. Whereas the Protoss have the Star Sovereign and the Solarian and the Empyrean and the Epigraph. And maybe the Epigraph is a stretch. It's more of a destroyer, corvette, or whatever. And the Terrans have the Centaur, the Minotaur, the Magnetar, the Phobos, the Hippogriff. So they've got like the most in terms of heavy spacecraft. I think the Askosi would probably have the most in terms of fighters. And I'm not sure that they would have like a single significant big one. I think what's fearsome about the Askosi is the things that their comparatively small craft and vehicles and even infantry can do, like in terms of relative power. Yet they, in the deft hands, piloted by the right kind of player, they can do absolutely insane things, and that's sort of like where their micro focus comes into play. And so I think that's really cool as a premise. And so I guess the way that they will differ is probably that they will be more than the sum of their parts, and they will have many, many parts. So I'm still reserving the right to potentially make a capital craft or something that competes with it or whatever. But that's my gut reaction. Is I haven't finished planning out all the race yet, but that is definitely something that I'm thinking about, is how to make it so that they can compete without necessarily having a lot of capital ships. So there you go. That's another coffee section taken care of. That's another podcast taken care of. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me for this episode of Pr0totype. I will have many, many more episodes in the future. Please continue to send in the support and spread the word. Cosmonarchy is going places. The new vision for the real-time strategy. Not only that, hop into our Discord server, join some events. We're going to be running a bunch of them. We'll see you soon.